if we look at the concept of prophecy or prophethood in Islam. So all three of these religions share a concept of prophethood, of the idea that God speaks or communicates important teachings, important laws or rules or rituals to human beings through designated persons who are referred to as prophets. But even the idea of prophethood is somewhat different in the three traditions, right? If you said to someone who was Jewish, oh, let's go and read about the prophets, they would probably think most specifically of prophets like Isaiah or Hosea or Amos or Jeremiah, the prophets who prophesied during the kingdom period in Israelite history when things were becoming very corrupt. They were preaching against this corruption. They were warning of the destruction that would come with the Assyrian invasion, Babylonian invasion. And so when you say prophets in Judaism, it's usually connected with those prophets, right? You may know that the Jewish scripture, the Hebrew Bible, has three sections: the Torah, the Nevi'im, which means prophets, very similar, of course, related to the Nebi, the Arabic word for prophet, and the Ketuvim, the writings. And so when you say the prophets in the Jewish tradition, you're largely talking about the Nevi'im, those prophets that are covered in that middle section of the Hebrew scriptures, right? Moses, of course, is certainly considered to be a prophet in the Jewish tradition, but it's that period that is defined most closely in the Jewish tradition with prophethood. In Christianity, of course, Christians recognize these prophets, these Jewish prophets, as people delivering God's message, but they interpret their prophecy as being ultimately a prophecy for the coming of Christ. Okay, so they reinterpret that prophecy, and because the prophet's primary function in Christianity was to foretell the coming of Christ, once Christ comes, prophets are no longer necessary. Christ's coming sort of obviates, makes unnecessary future prophets. In Islam, the concept of a prophet is much broader. Anyone who comes and brings a message, a particular message for their community, a more universal message, a message of reform, a message bringing an entirely new ritual or legal tradition, all of those figures are considered prophets. And in Islam, prophethood is considered to be universal. The Quran says that God sent messengers to every community, to every people. No community has been left without a prophet being sent to them. There's a tradition that says that God sent 124,000 prophets, but the Quran mentions 25 or 26 by name. And it's generally considered that almost anyone who is named with a proper name in the Quran is a prophet. Almost. But as a kind of general rule. Okay? So prophethood is much bigger in Islam. So if we look at this list of prophets mentioned by name, some are just mentioned quickly and their stories aren't told, and some have their story, like Moses, have their stories told at great length. But these are the prophets who are mentioned in the Quran. If you look at this list, what might you say? What observations might you make about this list of prophets in relation to what I just said? Yes?
Most of them are in the Hebrew or Christian tradition.
Mm-hmm. Right. Most of them have a counterpart or have exactly the same name or similar name in the biblical tradition. That's right. There are some other names that are not, right? And those are often considered Arab prophets, right? So for example, Hud, Saleh, Shuaib, who's actually the father-in-law of Moses, right? Although it's Jethro in the Bible. Those are considered to be Arab prophets. Right? Now, the Quran doesn't make a tremendous distinction between them. It brings this whole prophetic history together in many places and sees it as having a similar purpose. But yes, the majority of figures here have some counterpart in the Bible. Anything else? We look at the first prophet. First name in the list is Adam. In Judaism and Christianity, Adam is very important. He's the first man. He's not typically considered a prophet. Right? Noah, yes, has a prophetic message, but even Abraham is not typically referred to as a prophet, right? He's one of the patriarchs in Judaism. Isaac, Ishmael, Jacob, Joseph. They're all patriarchs. They're important people. They carry the covenant from the Jewish point of view that was originally given to Abraham. But they're not typically referred to as prophets. Aaron, not typically referred to as a prophet. He's a priest. David and Solomon. David and Solomon are what in the biblical tradition? They're kings. They're kings that sometimes do things wrong in the biblical tradition. They're not in the Islamic tradition, but in the biblical tradition they do. And when they do, they have to be corrected by prophets. Prophets come and correct them and tell them to change what they're doing. Okay? So, and of course, Jesus, we point that out, for Christians, is not considered a prophet. That's not a term that's used for him. So it's important to understand that when we talk about prophets in the Quran, we're talking about a much broader category that includes lots of figures from biblical sacred history, but really understands them differently, understands them as all part of the same prophetic phenomenon. All right. So, as I said before, there are certain prophets that are told, whose stories are told in much greater detail in the Quran, for example, the story of Moses. But the prophets also are distinguished to some extent in terms of their importance in the Islamic tradition. So I have 5 figures here who have an asterisk after their name. So Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad. And these are usually considered to be the 5 most important prophets, 5 major prophets in the Islamic tradition. But in many ways, as I'm just going to say, as I'm going to demonstrate in my next slide, Abraham has a very specific kind of role, a very important role to play in Islam.